If you are 61, I want you to hear me clearly. Most people think the important retirement ages are 59 and a half, 62, 65, maybe 73. They focus on the ages where something obvious happens, a penalty disappears, a benefit begins, a requirement shows up. Those ages get all the attention because the system finally speaks up. But I have spent my life studying how money behaves when people wait too long to understand it. And I will tell you something that matters far more than most people realize. 61 is not just another birthday. 61 is a deadline. It is the last clean year when your retirement planning is still almost entirely on your terms. Your tax flexibility is still under your control. Your healthcare positioning is still under your control. Your income design is still under your control after that. The system begins to answer back. And once the system starts answering back, every move gets harder, more crowded, and more expensive. That is why I want to walk you through this carefully. I want to show you why 61 is so powerful, what changes at 62 and 63, why so many retirees miss this window simply because it does not feel urgent, and what you can still do at 61 that becomes dramatically harder later, because the difference between a retirement you design and a retirement you react to often comes down to one thing. Did you use 61 wisely, or did you drift past it? Most people miss the power of 61 because nothing dramatic happens on the surface. There is no big government notice. There is no obvious penalty for doing nothing. There is no forced decision that makes you sit down at the kitchen table and pay attention. That quiet is exactly what fools people. The ages people obsess over are noisy ages. Something begins, something ends, something gets turned on, something gets taken away. 61 is different. That is what makes it valuable. At 61, Social Security is not available yet. That means your planning this year is not yet being run through that future. Benefit lends every 5 minutes. You do not have to measure every move against a benefit that is now sitting there, visible, tempting, and psychologically pulling on every decision. At 61, the Medicare or Maya look-back window has not started yet. Your income this year is not going to reach forward and raise your Medicare premiums at 65. That shadow cost is not sitting on top of every Roth conversion and every capital gain. At 61, required minimum distributions are still nowhere near forcing money out of your traditional accounts. You still have room to shape the future instead of being pushed around by it. That combination matters more than people think. You can do Roth conversions, you can harvest capital gains, you can optimize for AKA subsidies. If you are not yet on Medicare, you can position your income deliberately. And you can do all of that while the different systems are still relatively separate from each other. That is the key at 61. The pieces are still movable. A year or two later, those same pieces start locking together in ways that reduce your freedom. I have watched people reach retirement with a large IRA, decent taxable savings, maybe a Roth account, maybe a gap before Medicare, and they assume they still have plenty of time to figure it out. Then 62 shows up, then 63 shows up, then one decision starts colliding with another. Then the clean planning window is gone. The retirees who understand what 61 really is do not treat it like a waiting room. They use it, they move money intentionally, they front-load tax strategies while the cost is still manageable. They build flexibility for the next 3 decades while the system is still relatively quiet. The retirees who miss it usually do not miss it because they are foolish. They miss it because 61 feels harmless. It feels like there is still plenty of runway. That is the mistake. If you are 61, the system is listening at 62 and beyond. It starts talking back. And once it starts talking back, you no longer have full control over the conversation. Now let me show you why that happens. The first big change comes at 62. At 62, Social Security eligibility begins. Now, whether you claim at 62 or not is not the point here. Many people do not claim right away. In a lot of cases, delaying makes good sense. But the moment you become eligible, Social Security enters the room, whether you turn it on or not. That changes the planning environment. Before 62, Social Security is simply not part of this year's available income equation at 61. That gives you a kind of clarity most people do not appreciate until it is gone. At 62, Even if you delay, every financial decision starts getting viewed through the question of how it interacts with benefits that could begin now or in a few years. Or later, the math changes. The psychology changes. And in retirement planning, psychology matters. A lot of people underestimate that part. They think this is only about formulas. It is not. It is about what a benefit sitting on the table does to your thinking. Once Social Security becomes available, people start evaluating today's income moves against future claiming decisions. They start second guessing Roth conversions because they are thinking about future taxation of benefits. They start thinking about whether claiming earlier or later changes the trade-offs. They start planning not with a clean slate, but with a new moving part already introduced into the machine. That moving part is not small. Once Social Security is relevant, you also have to think about provisional income. That is the formula that determines how much of your Social Security becomes taxable. And the ugly truth is that the thresholds are easier to hit than most people expect. That means the moment Social Security becomes part of your real planning horizon, every additional dollar of income can begin to interact with benefits in a way that makes the tax result worse than it looked on the surface. At 61, you do not have that complication yet. At 62, you do. That is why I call 61 the last clean year. It is not that 62 is bad. It is that 62 is more crowded. It is more mentally noisy. It is more interconnected. The simplicity you had at 61 is gone the moment you cross over. And it is not just about whether you claim early. If you do claim early, income starts arriving and immediately affects the rest of the planning picture. If you delay, you are still planning around a benefit that now exists in the background. And that changes how you look at conversions, gains, and future tax layering. Either way, the clean room environment disappears. Now let us move 1 year further, because 63 is where a lot of people get blindsided. At 63, the Medicare IRMAIA look back begins to matter. IRMAIA is one of those things that sounds technical until you have to pay it. Then it becomes very real. It is a surcharge on Medicare premiums based on income. In plain English, it means you can end up paying more for the same Medicare coverage simply because your income crossed a line, and the system does not care if you crossed it by a lot or by a dollar. Cross it, and you are in the higher tier. That is bad enough. The part that really catches people is the 2-year look back. Your income at 63 can affect what you pay at 65. Your income at 64 can affect what you pay at 66. So a move that seems harmless in the moment can come back later as a completely different bill. That shadow cost changes how you should think about aggressive tax planning. A sizable Roth conversion at 61 can be purely a tax decision. A sizable Roth conversion at 63 might also be a Medicare premium decision. That is a major difference. Same conversion, same dollars, different consequences. That is why 61 is so valuable. At 61, you still have a chance to make substantial moves before the IRMAIA look-back window begins stalking your income decisions. You can convert more aggressively. You can recognize gains more freely. You can position yourself without having to ask, what is this going to do to Medicare 2 years from now? Later, you do have to ask that, and that makes everything harder. This is where good retirement planning separates itself from casual retirement planning. Casual planning says, I will just spread conversions out over my 60s. That sounds sensible. Sometimes it is not, because the same total amount converted can lead to very different lifetime outcomes depending on when you do it. Front load more of it at 61, when IRMAIA is not in play, and the long-term cost can be much lower. Wait and do those same moves across years where Social Security, aka considerations, and Medicare lookbacks are all crowding the field. And suddenly what looks smooth becomes clumsy. A lot of people think retirement planning is about avoiding taxes this year. I do not think that way. I think about minimizing stupidity over a long span of time. And one of the stupidest patterns I see is when someone protects one clean year so carefully that they walk straight into 10 messy years later. It is the lifetime result that matters, not the emotional comfort of doing nothing this year. That is the lens you need at 61. Now let us talk about what makes 61 not just a year to avoid mistakes, but a year to create advantages. At 61, you can layer several strategies together in a way that later becomes much more complicated. That layering is the whole game. A retiree who only thinks about one move at a time usually misses the real opportunity. The real opportunity is in the interaction. At 61, you may be able to do a meaningful Roth conversion. You may be able to harvest capital gains at favorable rates. You may be able to qualify for AK subsidies if you are not yet on Medicare, and you may be able to structure your income so that the next few years are easier, not harder. Those are not isolated tactics. They are connected pieces. And this is why 61 is so powerful. You can still coordinate those pieces without Social Security already sitting in the middle of the table and without IRMAA already punishing future Medicare premiums. That clean coordination window does not last. Suppose you convert too much to Roth. Your adjusted gross income rises. That may be fine if you plan for it. But if you are also trying to stay within AKA subsidy ranges, then every extra dollar matters. Suppose you also want to harvest some capital gains. That raises income too. Now you are balancing conversions, gains, and subsidy thresholds all at once. At 61, that puzzle is still solvable in a relatively clean way. At 63 or 65, once additional systems are interfering, the puzzle becomes much more crowded. You start sacrificing one advantage to preserve another. You start losing the clean optimization that 61 made possible. I like to think about it this way. Retirement planning is not one lever. It is a control panel. And at 61, more of the switches still work independently. Later, the switches are wired together, touch one. And two others react. That is when people stop designing and start improvising. The people who do best in retirement are not always the people with the biggest accounts. Often they are the people who made the most intelligent moves while their options were still broad. That is what 61 offers you, option breadth. Now let me show you why that matters so much for the long haul. The decision you make at 61 does not stay at 61. It echoes, it changes the size of your pre-tax accounts later. It changes the size of your future required minimum distributions. It changes how much bracket space gets consumed automatically in your 70s. It changes how much room you have left for conversions later. It changes how much of retirement you spend in control versus in reaction. Every dollar you move from a traditional IRA to a Roth at 6 the 1st of may create a tax bill. Now that part scares people, but fear by itself is useless. The relevant question is not whether you pay tax now. The relevant question is whether paying 12% or 22% now is better than being forced to pay 24% or 32% later on the same money after RMDs and other income have already filled the lower brackets. That is the real comparison. Most people compare doing something today with doing nothing today. That is the wrong comparison. The right comparison is doing something today versus getting pushed into something worse later. Once required minimum distributions begin, you are no longer deciding whether income comes out of those accounts. The IRS is deciding that part for you. And those forced withdrawals take up space every year, whether you need the money or not. That is why retirees with large untouched IRAs often feel trapped later in life. By the time they finally realize the problem, they have less room to solve it. RMDs fill up the lower brackets. Then any Roth conversion they want to do sits on top of that forced income. Then the tax rate climbs. Then the feeling of control disappears. Now they are not managing brackets. The brackets are managing them. That is a miserable position to be in after spending a lifetime building wealth. And the setup for that miserable position often happened years earlier, when 61 came and went with no action. I want you to think about income floor here because this is a useful idea. The moves you make around 61 help establish the tax floor and income structure. That much of the rest of retirement gets built upon. If you reduce future IRA balances through thoughtful conversions, you may lower future RMDs. If you lower future RMDs, you preserve more bracket room later. If you preserve more bracket room later, you keep more flexibility when life throws something at you. That is how intelligent early planning buys freedom later. And freedom is the real prize. Not activity, not complexity, freedom. This is also why missing 61 has an emotional cost, not just a mathematical one. People do not talk enough about the psychology of moving from accumulation to decumulation. When you are working and saving, the pattern is simple. You earn, you invest, you watch the pile grow. That feels good. It feels like progress. It feels like control. Retirement is different. Now money is moving out instead of in. If your accounts and tax picture are well designed, that can still feel orderly. You know what you are withdrawing, you know why, you know how it fits the larger plan, you know what tax cost you accepted, and you know what future cost you avoided. There is confidence in that. But if you reach retirement without having used the clean planning years, well, every withdrawal starts to feel like a question mark. Should I take this from the IRA? Should I take it from taxable? Should I touch the Roth? Am I creating a tax issue? Am I raising Medicare costs later? Am I making Social Security more taxable? Am I doing this wrong? That uncertainty wears people down. You can have substantial wealth and still feel poor if every move feels dangerous. You can have less wealth and still feel secure if the structure is sound. That is why I care so much about control. The retirees who use 61 well tend to feel more settled later because they know they took action. When action was cleanest, they know the system did not back them into a corner without a fight. The retirees who drifted past 61 often spend years reacting to rules they never properly anticipated. And once you are reacting, stress goes up, you start chasing thresholds you should have prepared for earlier. You start regretting things that were much easier to fix when the planning window was open. That is avoidable. Now let me pull all of this together in plain language. Why is 61 so important? Because it is the last year before Social Security eligibility enters the picture at 62 and complicates the way you think about income and future taxation of benefits. Because it is the last year before the Medicare or MA look-back becomes relevant at 63 and starts putting a delayed premium cost on today's income decisions. Because it still gives you time to layer Roth conversions, capital gains harvesting, aka subsidy, optimization, and deliberate income positioning without all those systems interfering with each other. Because the decisions you make there shape the size of your IRA, the size of your future RMDs, and the tax flexibility you will have for decades. And because once you miss it, you do not really get another year that clean. You get later years, you get more crowded years, you get years where the system has more leverage than you do. That is why I call it a deadline. Not to create drama, to tell the truth. Deadlines matter precisely because they pass quietly until they are gone. If you are 61 now, this is not the year to say, I will deal with this later. This is the year to get precise. This is the year to know what is in your traditional IRA, what is in your Roth, what is in taxable accounts, what your spending need is, what tax bracket you are actually occupying, how much room you have for conversion, how much gain you can harvest, what your AK subsidy thresholds are if they matter to you, and how those decisions change the next 10, 20, 30 years. That is not overplanning. That is responsibility. You work too hard for your money to enter retirement by default. Default is expensive. Default is how people stumble into taxable Social Security, surprise Medicare premiums, larger than necessary RMDs, and decades of reduced flexibility design beats default. That is the entire lesson. Let me say one more thing, because this is where many people hesitate. They think, what if I make the wrong move? That is a fair question, but there is another risk that is often larger. What if you do nothing during the last clean planning year and the wrong move is the one you made by inaction? Because in retirement planning, inaction is not neutral. Inaction is still a decision. If you skip Roth conversions when the tax cost is attractive, that is a decision. If you let future RMDs grow unchecked, that is a decision. If you avoid doing the hard math at 61 because nothing forces you to, that is a decision. And the system will happily build on that decision later. I am not telling you that every 61-year-old should make the same move. That would be nonsense. Different health, different balances, different marriage situations, different spending, different state taxes, different goals. What I am telling you is that 61 is the year to make deliberate moves. Maybe that means larger Roth conversions than you expected. Maybe it means carefully realizing gains while staying inside a favorable range. Maybe it means structuring income to preserve aka subsidies. Maybe it means getting brutally honest about the future tax cost of an oversized IRA. Maybe it means all of the above. What matters is not that the tactic is identical for everybody. What matters is that the year is uniquely powerful for almost everybody. And power unused tends to become regret. If I were sitting across the table from you and you had just turned 61, I would not treat that as a casual fact. I would treat it as a planning trigger. I would ask you how much future tax trouble is sitting in your traditional accounts. I would ask you whether your next 2 years of income are being shaped intentionally or accidentally. I would ask you whether you are using this clean window before Social Security complexity and Medicare lookbacks start interfering. I would ask you whether you want retirement to feel like a machine you control or a machine you are trapped inside, because that is really the choice. The retirees who understand 61 do not wait for later milestones to tell them what to do. They act while acting is still clean. They understand that the best time to fix a future tax problem is before it hardens into a permanent feature of retirement. They understand that the best time to create flexibility is before the rules narrow the path. And they understand that what looks like just another year can be the hinge that the whole next chapter swings on. So, no, I do not think 61 is just another birthday. I think it is the most important age for your entire retirement because it is the last moment when so many high-value decisions can still be made with clarity. Before Social Security muddies the field, before Medicare lookbacks cast a shadow over every extra dollar, before required distributions start bossing you around, before later life tax brackets become a prison of your own earlier delay, that is the real message. Use 61 before 62 complicates the picture. Use 61 before 63 gives your income a second cost. Use 61 before your 70s take flexibility off the table. And above all, use 61 before you wake up one day in retirement and realize the system has been designing more of your life than you have. That is a bad place to arrive. The good news is you do not have to arrive there. If you are 61, you still have a clean shot at shaping the next 30 years with more intelligence, more control, and less waste. And that is worth treating seriously because retirement is not won by crossing a finish line at some official age. It is won by recognizing the few moments that actually matter and acting while the odds are still in your favor. For a great many people, 61 is one of those moments. Treat it that way.